There's a moment in every person's life when they realize that power isn't about the title on your door. It's about the secrets you carry and the timing of their revelation. For me, that moment came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, in conference room B, when my boss looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're not fit for leadership." What he didn't know was that the company director was listening through the door, and that I had been carrying a secret that would change everything in the next 12 minutes. By 4 p.m., 3 careers would be forever altered. One would be destroyed. One would be elevated beyond imagination. And one would simply vanish into corporate legend. Have you ever felt the weight of institutional betrayal pressing down on your chest like a physical force? That suffocating sensation when you realize that merit, dedication, and results mean nothing in the face of corporate politics and personal vendettas? That was my reality for 18 months, working under Marcus Whitfield, a man who had turned my professional existence into a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare. My name is Sarah Chen, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I was the senior project manager at Meridian Dynamics, a mid-sized consulting firm where I had spent 5 years building what I thought was an unshakable reputation. I had delivered every project on time, exceeded every target, mentored junior staff, and even saved the company from 2 potential lawsuits through my meticulous attention to detail. But none of that mattered to Marcus. He had been my direct supervisor for 18 months, ever since his lateral transfer from the Chicago office. From day one, there was something predatory in the way he observed me. Not sexual, but something far more insidious. It was the gaze of someone who saw me as a threat to be neutralized rather than a resource to be developed. The psychological campaign began subtly. Credit for my ideas would mysteriously migrate to other team members during presentations. My reports would be lost in email chains, forcing me to scramble to recreate work at the last minute. Meeting invitations would arrive with incorrect times, leaving me walking into rooms where decisions had already been made without my input. But Marcus was clever. He never left fingerprints. Everything could be explained as miscommunication, technical glitches, honest mistakes. To anyone looking from the outside, I was simply paranoid, a high-performing employee who couldn't handle the natural pressures of corporate life. The true artistry of Marcus's campaign lay not in its brutality, but in its surgical precision. He understood that destroying someone's career in the modern corporate world requires finesse. You can't simply fire a high performer without cause. You have to make them destroy themselves. The Pemberton project was his masterpiece. It was our largest client engagement of the year, a complete digital transformation for a Fortune 500 manufacturing company, the kind of project that makes or breaks careers, with a budget that could fund a small country's GDP. When the assignment came down from the director's office, everyone knew it was a career-defining opportunity. Marcus assigned it to me with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Sarah, this is your chance to prove you're ready for the next level," he said during our one-on-one meeting. "I'm counting on you to show what you're really made of." What I didn't realize at the time was that he had already begun laying the groundwork for my failure. The project timeline was aggressive but manageable. 6 months to complete a full system overhaul, staff training, and implementation. I assembled a team of our best people, created detailed project plans, and began the intricate dance of client management that separates successful consultants from those who flame out spectacularly. But strange things began, happening almost immediately. Key team members would be pulled into other urgent projects without warning. Technical specifications would change overnight with no documentation of who authorized the modifications. Client meetings would be rescheduled at the last minute, often while I was already en route to their offices. Most insidiously, Marcus began what I later recognized as death by 1,000 cuts, a relentless barrage of minor crises and administrative burdens that consumed my time and energy, preventing me from focusing on the strategic elements that actually mattered. Corporate warfare is unlike any other form of conflict because it masquerades as collaboration. Your enemies smile at you in meetings, offer helpful suggestions that are actually traps, and express concern for your well-being while systematically dismantling your professional foundation. Marcus was a virtuoso of this dark art. He would schedule check-in meetings every other day, ostensibly to offer support, but actually to micromanage every decision and create a paper trail of my supposed inadequacies. Each meeting would generate follow-up emails with action items that were either impossible to complete in the given time frame or contradicted previous directives. "Sarah, I think we need to be more aggressive with the client timeline," he would say in one meeting. Then, 3 days later, "Sarah, I'm concerned that you're pushing too hard. We need to be more collaborative in our approach." The cognitive dissonance was maddening. I began second-guessing every decision, every communication, every strategic choice. The confident professional who had thrived for 5 years was slowly being replaced by someone who jumped at shadows and apologized for existing. But the most devastating aspect of his campaign wasn't the professional sabotage, it was the isolation. Marcus had a gift for poisoning wells. In casual conversations with other managers, he would express concern about my stress levels, my ability to handle pressure, my communication challenges with team members. Always framed as worry for my well-being, never as criticism of my competence. Gradually, I noticed changes in how colleagues interacted with me. Invitations to informal gatherings dried up. Conversations would pause when I entered rooms. Other department heads began bypassing me on interdisciplinary projects, going directly to Marcus instead. I was being erased from the social fabric of the organization while simultaneously being held responsible for increasingly impossible deliverables. The Pemberton Project reached its critical phase in month 4, just as Marcus's psychological campaign was reaching its crescendo. By this point, I was working 16-hour days, sleeping in my office more often than at home, and consuming enough caffeine to power a small city. The project was actually going well. Better than well, it was exceeding expectations. Client satisfaction scores were through the roof. Implementation milestones were being hit ahead of schedule, and the preliminary results were showing ROI numbers that would make this a case study for years to come. But Marcus had been preparing for this possibility. During our weekly leadership team meeting, he stood up with a concerned expression that I now recognize as the face of someone about to commit professional murder. "I need to address some concerns about the Pemberton Project," he announced to the room full of senior managers. "While Sarah has been working very hard, I'm seeing some troubling patterns in client communications and team management that I think we need to discuss." He proceeded to present a carefully curated collection of out-of-context emails, selective quotes from team feedback, and client comments that painted a picture of a project manager who was overwhelmed, abrasive, and potentially damaging client relationships. Every piece of evidence was technically accurate but stripped of context. A firm email about deadline adherence became aggressive communication. A client's minor concern about a technical detail became serious. Relationship management issues, team members' complaints about the demanding schedule became leadership problems. The other managers listened with the uncomfortable attention of people watching a public execution. I tried to respond, to provide context, to explain the full picture. But Marcus had orchestrated this moment perfectly. Every defense I offered sounded like excuse-making. Every clarification seemed to confirm his narrative of a manager in denial about her own inadequacies. "I think," Marcus concluded with false reluctance, "that we need to seriously consider whether Sarah is ready for projects of this magnitude. Perhaps it would be better for everyone, including Sarah, if we brought in additional oversight." What none of us knew was that Director Elizabeth Hawthorne had been conducting her own investigation. Elizabeth was a legend in the consulting world, a woman who had built her reputation on an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. She had joined Meridian Dynamics 6 months earlier as part of a strategic restructuring brought in specifically to identify and develop the next generation of leadership talent. While Marcus had been executing his campaign against me, Elizabeth had been watching. Not just watching me, but watching him. Watching the dynamics, the patterns, the subtle shifts in team morale and project outcomes. She had noticed that projects under Marcus's direct supervision had a curious pattern of last-minute complications and team turnover. She had observed that high-performing employees seemed to lose confidence and effectiveness after extended exposure to his management style. She had seen the correlation between Marcus's concerns about team members and their subsequent departure from the company. But Elizabeth was too experienced to act on suspicion alone. She needed evidence, patterns, documentation, so she began her own quiet investigation, interviewing former team members who had left the company, analyzing project outcomes, reviewing client feedback that hadn't been filtered through Marcus's reports. The picture that emerged was devastating. Marcus wasn't just a bad manager. He was a systematic destroyer of talent. Over his 18 months at Meridian, 7 high-performing employees had either quit or been transferred to other departments after working under him. Project budgets consistently ran over, not due to scope creep or client changes, but due to inefficiencies created by his management style. Most damning of all, Elizabeth discovered that Marcus had been actively undermining the Pemberton project. Not enough to cause outright failure, but enough to create the appearance of problems that he could then blame on my leadership. The breakthrough came when Elizabeth interviewed Janet Morrison, a former senior analyst who had quit 6 months earlier after working on one of Marcus's projects. Janet had been reluctant to speak. Initially, corporate NDAs and professional, courtesy creating barriers to honesty. But Elizabeth had a way of creating safe spaces for truth-telling. "Janet," she said during their coffee meeting, "I'm not looking to create problems for anyone. I'm trying to understand patterns that might help us better support our team members. Anything you share will be kept confidential unless it reveals illegal activity." Janet's story was heartbreakingly familiar. The same gradual erosion of confidence, the same impossible double binds, the same systematic isolation from colleagues and decision-making processes. But Janet revealed something that Elizabeth hadn't known. Marcus had been actively coaching other team members to provide negative feedback about the people he wanted to eliminate. "He would pull me aside," Janet explained, "and say things like, 'I'm concerned about Sarah's stress levels. Have you noticed any communication issues? Or do you think Sarah might be overwhelmed by this project?' He never directly asked me to say negative things, but the implication was clear. If I wanted to stay in his good graces, I needed to validate his concerns." This revelation prompted Elizabeth to dig deeper into the Pemberton project specifically. She began conducting her own interviews with team members, clients, and stakeholders, not through Marcus, but directly. What she discovered was a project that was actually exceeding expectations in every meaningful metric, being managed by a leader who was working miracles under artificially created adverse conditions. The client loved me. The team respected my technical competence and leadership, even as they struggled with the artificial pressures Marcus had created. The results spoke for themselves. Ahead of schedule, under budget, exceeding quality standards. But Marcus had been preparing his narrative for months, collecting selective evidence and coaching witnesses to support his predetermined conclusion. The meeting that would change everything was scheduled for Tuesday, March 15th at 3:30 p.m. It was positioned as a project review and strategic planning session for the Pemberton engagement, but I knew it was actually my professional execution. Marcus had been building toward this moment for weeks, dropping hints about difficult conversations and the need to make some tough decisions about project leadership. The other attendees were carefully chosen. 3 senior managers who had been exposed to his narrative about my inadequacies, plus Janet's replacement, a junior analyst who had been thoroughly indoctrinated in Marcus's version of reality. I arrived at the meeting knowing it was likely my last stand. I had prepared comprehensive documentation of the project's success metrics, client testimonials, team feedback that hadn't been filtered through Marcus's interpretation. I was ready to fight for my professional life. What I didn't know was that Elizabeth had been preparing for this moment as well. She had spent the previous week conducting final interviews, reviewing documentation, and building her own comprehensive picture of the situation. She had also made a decision that would prove pivotal. She was going to observe this meeting personally, not as a participant. That would have changed the dynamics entirely. But as a silent witness, positioned in the adjacent conference room where she could hear everything through the shared wall. Marcus began the meeting with his characteristic false concern. "I want to start by acknowledging that Sarah has been working incredibly hard on the Pemberton project. Her dedication is unquestionable. However, I think we need to have an honest conversation about some concerning patterns that have emerged. He proceeded to present his carefully constructed case. Selective client feedback, out-of-context team comments, budget concerns that existed only in his manipulated projections. Each point was delivered with the precision of a prosecutor who had spent months building a case. The other managers listened with uncomfortable attention. I could see in their faces the recognition that they were witnessing something unpleasant but necessary, a talented employee who had simply reached the limits of her competence. The reality, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of false regret, is that leadership at this level requires a specific set of skills and temperament. It's not enough to be technically competent or hardworking. You need to be able to manage complex stakeholder relationships, maintain team morale under pressure, and make strategic decisions that balance competing priorities. He paused, looking directly at me with eyes that held no warmth, no humanity, only the cold satisfaction of someone about to deliver a killing blow. Sarah, I don't think you're fit for leadership at this level. The words hung in the air like poison gas. I felt the familiar sensation of the ground disappearing beneath my feet, the crushing weight of institutional rejection, the humiliation of being professionally executed in front of colleagues who had once respected me. But something strange happened in that moment of devastation. Instead of the usual spiral into self-doubt and defensive scrambling, I felt a curious sense of clarity. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the recognition that I had nothing left to lose. But suddenly I could see the entire situation with perfect, crystalline precision. Marcus, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I need to ask you something directly. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting pushback at this stage of his carefully orchestrated performance. In your professional opinion, what would constitute success for the Pemberton project? Well, he said, slightly thrown by the question. On-time delivery, budget adherence, client satisfaction, team morale, the usual metrics. And how would you rate the current project performance against those metrics? I could see him calculating, trying to figure out where I was going with this line of questioning. There are concerns in several areas that we've been discussing. Specifically, Sarah, I don't think this is the appropriate forum for— No, Marcus. I think this is exactly the appropriate forum. My voice was gaining strength, fed by months of suppressed frustration and the sudden, liberating realization that I had nothing left to lose. You've made serious allegations about my leadership competence. I think it's fair to ask for specific evidence. The dynamic in the room shifted palpably. The other managers who had been passive observers of my professional execution suddenly found themselves witnesses to something entirely different, a cross-examination. The client satisfaction scores for Pemberton are currently at 4.8 out of 5, I continued, pulling out documentation that I had prepared for exactly this moment. That's the highest score for any project in the company's history. Would you consider that a concern? Marcus's jaw tightened. Client satisfaction is just one metric. You're right. Let's talk about budget performance. We're currently 12% under budget and ahead of schedule on every major milestone. Is that also a concern? Budget performance doesn't tell the whole story about leadership effectiveness. Then let's talk about team performance. Despite the artificial constraints and resource challenges that have been imposed on this project, team productivity metrics are 23% above company average. Team retention is 100%. No one has quit or requested transfer. Are these also indicators of failed leadership? I could see panic beginning to creep into Marcus's eyes. This wasn't going according to his script. The other managers were starting to look confused, glancing between him and the documentation I was presenting. Sarah, you're cherry-picking metrics to avoid addressing the real issues. What real issues, Marcus? Be specific. Give me one concrete example of a leadership failure that has negatively impacted project outcomes. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling to find solid ground in what had become quicksand. It was at that moment that we heard the conference room door open. Elizabeth Hawthorne walked in with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Her presence changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Suddenly, we weren't just colleagues having a difficult conversation. We were subordinates being observed by the person who ultimately controlled all of our professional fates. I apologize for interrupting, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't apologetic at all. but I've been listening to this conversation, and I think there are some things that need to be clarified. Elizabeth moved to the head of the table, with the fluid confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. She placed a thick folder on the table, a folder that seemed to radiate ominous energy. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that makes seasoned executives nervous, "you've made some serious allegations about Sarah's leadership competence. Before we proceed with any decisions about the Pemberton project, I think it would be appropriate to review the complete picture." She opened the folder and began distributing documents to everyone in the room. "These are the actual client feedback reports, not the selective excerpts that were shared earlier, but the complete communications from Pemberton's executive team over the past 4 months." As the other managers read through the documents, their expressions began to change. The client feedback wasn't just positive, it was glowing. The CEO of Pemberton had specifically requested that I be assigned to their next project. The CTO had written an unsolicited email praising my technical expertise and strategic thinking. "Now," Elizabeth continued, "let's look at the actual budget performance data." More documents were distributed. The numbers were undeniable. The Pemberton project wasn't just under budget. It was performing at levels that would set new company benchmarks for efficiency and profitability. "And finally," Elizabeth said, her gaze settling on Marcus with laser-like intensity, "let's review the team feedback that wasn't filtered through management interpretation." The final set of documents contained direct quotes from team members about my leadership style, work ethic, and ability to manage complex challenges. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with multiple team members specifically noting my ability to maintain morale and productivity despite unusual administrative challenges and resource constraints. Marcus had gone pale. The carefully constructed narrative that he had spent months building was crumbling in real time, replaced by objective evidence that painted a completely different picture. "Marcus," Elizabeth said, "would you care to explain the discrepancy between your assessment of Sarah's performance and the actual project data?" What happened next was like watching a controlled demolition. Elizabeth didn't just present evidence. She systematically dismantled 18 months of psychological warfare with the precision of a forensic accountant. "Over the past 3 months," she began, "I've been conducting a comprehensive review of project management practices across all departments. What I discovered was a pattern of concerning discrepancies between reported performance and actual outcomes." She turned to a fresh page in her folder. "Marcus, in the 18 months since your transfer from Chicago, 7 high-performing employees have either quit or requested transfers from your department. That's a 40% turnover rate in a company where the average departmental turnover is 8%. The other managers were now staring at Marcus with undisguised shock. This wasn't just about my performance. It was about a systematic pattern of management failure. "More concerning," Elizabeth continued, "is the correlation between employee departures and project performance. In every case, the employees who left were working on high-visibility projects that subsequently experienced budget overruns, timeline delays, or client satisfaction issues." She pulled out a chart that mapped the timeline of departures against project outcomes. The pattern was undeniable. Marcus's department was a graveyard of talent and failed initiatives. But the most troubling discovery was the evidence of active sabotage. The word sabotage hung in the air like an accusation of treason. Even I was shocked by the directness of Elizabeth's language. Through interviews with former team members and analysis of project documentation, I've identified a consistent pattern of artificial obstacles being created for specific employees. Resource reassignments that served no operational purpose, communication protocols that bypassed key team members, administrative requirements that consumed disproportionate time and energy. She looked directly at Marcus, who seemed to be shrinking in his chair. "Marcus, you've been systematically undermining your own team members, creating the appearance of performance problems that you then use to justify their removal or marginalization." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Elizabeth, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," she cut him off with surgical precision. "I have documented evidence of your communications with team members, coaching them to provide negative feedback about colleagues. I have email records showing your deliberate creation of administrative barriers. I have testimony from multiple former employees describing identical patterns of psychological manipulation. She stood up, her presence suddenly filling the entire room. But most damning of all, I have evidence that you've been actively sabotaging the Pemberton project, specifically to create justification for removing Sarah from leadership. She pulled out a final document, one that made Marcus go completely white. This is a record of your communications with the Pemberton client's IT department, requesting changes to project specifications without Sarah's knowledge or approval. Changes that were designed to create timeline pressures and budget conflicts that could then be blamed on her management. The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Marcus had been actively working against his own company's success to further his personal vendetta. "Marcus," Elizabeth said, her voice now carrying the finality of a judicial sentence, "you're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and HR will contact you regarding the transition of your responsibilities." She pressed a button on the conference room phone. "Security to conference room B, please." Marcus sat frozen, apparently unable to process the complete reversal of his carefully laid plans. 18 months of psychological warfare had been undone in 18 minutes of factual presentation. As security arrived to escort Marcus from the building, Elizabeth turned her attention to the rest of us. The other managers sat in stunned silence, clearly trying to process the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. "Sarah," Elizabeth said, her voice now carrying a warmth that had been absent during her systematic destruction of Marcus's career, "I owe you an apology. You've been subjected to a campaign of professional harassment that should never have been allowed to continue for as long as it did." I nodded, still processing the surreal reversal of fortune. 18 months of self-doubt and psychological torture had been validated and vindicated in a matter of minutes. "But more than an apology," Elizabeth continued, "I owe you recognition for what you've accomplished under impossible circumstances." She opened a different section of her folder. "The Pemberton project isn't just successful, it's exceptional. You've delivered results that exceed every benchmark we have for projects of this complexity and scale. You've done it while managing artificial obstacles that would have destroyed most project managers. And you've maintained team morale and client satisfaction at levels that frankly seem impossible given the circumstances." She paused, looking around the room at the other managers. Which brings me to the reason I wanted witnesses for this conversation. My heart began to race. There was something in her tone that suggested this reversal of fortune was about to become even more dramatic. "Sarah, I'm promoting you to Regional Director of Strategic Initiatives, effective immediately." The words hit me like lightning. Regional Director was 2 levels above my current position, a role that would put me in charge of all major client engagements across 3 states, with a team of over 50 consultants and project managers. The position comes with a 40% salary increase, equity participation, and direct reporting to the executive committee. You'll also be taking over Marcus's current projects, plus the 3 new Fortune 500 engagements that we're launching next quarter. I stared at her, certain that I was hallucinating. 6 minutes ago, I had been facing professional execution. Now I was being offered the kind of promotion that most people spend decades working toward. "I know this seems sudden," Elizabeth said, reading the shock on my face. "But I want you to understand that this decision isn't impulsive. I've been watching your performance for months, not just on Pemberton, but across all your projects. You have a rare combination of technical expertise, strategic thinking, and leadership ability that this company desperately needs." She sat back down, her demeanor shifting from corporate executioner to strategic mentor. "But there's another reason for this promotion that I want to share with you, because it illustrates something important about how real leadership works." She pulled out yet another document from her seemingly bottomless folder. 3 months ago, I received a call from the CEO of Pemberton Industries. He wasn't calling to complain. He was calling to poach you. My eyes widened. This was the first I had heard of any such conversation. He offered you a position as their Director of Digital Transformation, with a salary that would have been 60% higher than what you're making now. He wanted to hire you away from us specifically because of your work on their project. The room was dead silent. Even the other managers were leaning forward, clearly fascinated by this revelation. I told him that you weren't available, but his call made me realize something important. We had a world-class talent who was being systematically undermined by her direct supervisor. We were about to lose one of our best people because we had failed to protect her from internal sabotage. Elizabeth looked directly at me. So I began investigating, not just to understand what was happening to you, but to understand how we had allowed it to happen. What I discovered was that Marcus's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader cultural problem that we needed to address. She gestured to the other managers in the room, which is why I wanted witnesses for this conversation. Sarah's promotion isn't just recognition of her individual excellence. It's a statement about what kind of leadership behavior we value and what kind we will not tolerate. Elizabeth stood up again, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. What happened to Sarah could have happened to any of you. Corporate environments can become toxic when we allow personal agendas to override professional standards, when we enable managers who see talent as a threat rather than an asset. She began pacing, her energy building as she outlined a vision that went far beyond my individual situation. We're implementing new protocols for performance evaluation, conflict resolution, and management accountability. Every manager in this company will undergo training on recognizing and preventing workplace harassment. We're creating anonymous reporting mechanisms and regular team climate surveys. The other managers were taking notes, clearly understanding that this wasn't just a meeting about one project, it was a company-wide transformation. But most importantly, Elizabeth said, stopping to look at each person individually, we're changing our culture from one that tolerates destructive behavior to one that actively rewards collaborative excellence. She returned to her seat and fixed her gaze on me. Sarah, your promotion is effective immediately, but I want you to take the rest of this week to transition your current responsibilities and prepare for your new role. We'll announce the promotion company-wide on Monday, along with the launch of our new management excellence initiative. She smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her during the entire meeting. Also want you to know that the Pemberton client has requested that you personally oversee their next 3 projects. Apparently, they were so impressed with your work that they've structured their entire digital transformation roadmap around having you as their primary consultant. The magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. Not only had I survived Marcus's campaign of destruction, but I was emerging stronger and more successful than I had ever imagined possible. As the meeting concluded and the other managers filed out, Elizabeth asked me to stay behind for a private conversation. Sarah, she said once we were alone, there's something else I want to share with you, but I need your discretion. I nodded, still processing the dramatic reversal of my professional fortunes. Marcus's behavior here wasn't his first offense. We've discovered that he was transferred from the Chicago office specifically because of similar issues with talent management. HR there documented multiple complaints about his treatment of high-performing employees. But instead of addressing the problem, they simply moved him to a different location. The revelation was staggering. Marcus hadn't been transferred to our office as a promotion. He had been transferred as a way of avoiding dealing with his destructive behavior. We're conducting a full investigation of his tenure in Chicago, and we've already identified at least 3 cases where talented employees were driven out of the company by his management style. The cost to the organization in terms of lost talent and failed projects is in the millions. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her expression reflecting a mixture of anger and determination. This situation has exposed some serious flaws in our corporate systems. We had warning signs that we ignored, and we allowed a destructive manager to continue damaging people and projects because we prioritized avoiding difficult conversations over protecting our employees. She looked at me directly. Your experience and your resilience has become a catalyst for changes that will protect future employees from similar situations. In a very real sense, your refusal to be destroyed by Marcus's campaign has made this entire company stronger. But I want you to understand something important about what happened here today, Elizabeth continued. Your promotion isn't charity or compensation for what you endured. It's recognition of something extraordinary that you demonstrated under extreme pressure. She pulled out a final document, one that I hadn't seen before. This is a psychological evaluation that we conducted on all employees in Marcus's department over the past 6 months. We wanted to understand the impact of his management style on team performance and individual well-being. The document was thick, clearly representing a comprehensive analysis. What we found was that most employees showed decreased confidence, reduced initiative, and increased anxiety after extended exposure to his management approach. The psychological impact was measurable and significant. She turned to a specific page. But your profile was different. Despite being the primary target of his campaign, your performance metrics actually improved over time. Your confidence remained stable, your initiative increased, and your leadership skills became more refined under pressure. Elizabeth looked at me with something approaching awe. Sarah, you didn't just survive a sustained campaign of professional harassment, you thrived despite it. You maintained your ethical standards while being subjected to systematic manipulation. You continued to deliver exceptional results while being actively sabotaged. You protected your team members while being isolated from organizational support. The weight of her words began to sink in. I had always focused on what I was enduring, not on what I was accomplishing, despite the obstacles. That kind of resilience and integrity under pressure is exactly what we need in senior leadership positions. The promotion isn't just recognition of your past performance. It's an investment in your future potential. That evening, I sat in my office, my new office, which came with the promotion, trying to process the complete transformation of my professional reality. 18 hours earlier, I had been preparing for what I thought would be my professional execution. Now I was planning strategy for managing a team of 50 consultants and overseeing multi-million-dollar client engagements. But the external changes, dramatic as they were, paled in comparison to the internal transformation that had occurred. For 18 months, I had been slowly losing confidence in my own perceptions, my own abilities, my own worth. Marcus's campaign had been designed to make me doubt everything about myself, my competence, my judgment, my right to be in positions of leadership. The revelation that my perceptions had been accurate all along, that my performance had been exceptional despite the obstacles, that my leadership abilities were not only intact but had actually been strengthened by the challenges. It was like suddenly being able to see clearly after months of looking through a distorted lens. I realized that I had been carrying the weight of imposter syndrome that had been artificially implanted by someone who saw my competence as a threat to his own position. The self-doubt that had plagued me for months wasn't based on reality. It was the intended outcome of a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation. But more than that, I understood that my ability to maintain my performance and integrity despite that campaign revealed something about my character that I hadn't fully recognized before. I was stronger, more resilient, and more capable than I had ever given myself credit for. The announcement of my promotion sent shockwaves through the entire organization. Within hours, my phone was ringing with congratulations from colleagues, clients, and industry contacts who had heard the news through various networks. But the most meaningful responses came from the team members who had worked with me on the Pemberton project and other initiatives over the years. Sarah, said Jennifer, one of the senior analysts, I want you to know that working with you taught me what real leadership looks like. You never threw anyone under the bus, even when you were under incredible pressure. You protected us from the political garbage and let us focus on doing good work. Similar messages came from other team members, clients, and even competitors who had worked with me on joint ventures. The consistent theme was recognition of leadership qualities that I had been systematically told I lacked. The contrast between these authentic testimonials and Marcus's manufactured narrative was stark. Real leadership, I realized, isn't about commanding authority or controlling outcomes. It's about creating environments where people can do their best work while maintaining their dignity and professional growth. But perhaps the most significant ripple effect was the impact on the broader organizational culture. Elizabeth had been serious about using my situation as a catalyst for systemic change. Within 2 weeks, the company had implemented new management training programs, anonymous feedback systems, and regular team climate assessments. More importantly, they had established clear consequences for managers who created toxic work environments, regardless of their technical competence or political connections. 6 months later, I was settling into my role as regional director with a sense of purpose and confidence that I hadn't experienced in years. The Pemberton project had been completed not just successfully, but so exceptionally that it had become a case study taught in business schools. My team had expanded to include some of the most talented consultants in the industry, many of whom had specifically requested to work under my leadership. The 3 Fortune 500 clients that Elizabeth had mentioned had all signed multi-year contracts, specifically requesting that I oversee their strategic initiatives. But the most satisfying aspect of my new role wasn't the external recognition or financial rewards. It was the opportunity to create the kind of work environment that I had wished for during those dark months under Marcus's management. Implemented what I called authentic leadership principles or management, practices based on transparency, mutual respect, and the recognition that great results come from empowering people rather than controlling them. Team members were encouraged to share honest feedback without fear of retaliation. Credit was given where credit was due, and mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than ammunition for political warfare. Most importantly, I made it clear that anyone who attempted to undermine colleagues or create toxic dynamics would be removed from the team immediately. The results spoke for themselves. Team productivity increased by 35%, client satisfaction scores reached new company records, and employee retention in my division became the highest in the company's history. I learned through industry networks that Marcus's departure from Meridian Dynamics had effectively ended his career in consulting. Word of his termination and the reasons behind it had spread through professional circles, making him essentially unemployable in any senior management position. Initially, I felt a complex mixture of emotions about his fate. There was certainly satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also a recognition that his destructive behavior had ultimately destroyed his own career more thoroughly than it had ever threatened mine. Through former colleagues, I heard that he had struggled to find work for months, eventually taking a position at a much smaller firm, at a significantly reduced salary and responsibility level. Even there, his reputation preceded him, and he was reportedly under constant scrutiny from management who were aware of his history. But perhaps the most telling detail was that several of the employees he had driven out of previous positions had gone on to achieve significant success in their new roles. The problem employees he had identified were thriving in environments where their talents were recognized and supported rather than systematically undermined. It became clear that Marcus's real problem wasn't with any individual employee. It was with competence itself. He was threatened by anyone whose abilities might highlight his own limitations, leading him to create elaborate campaigns to eliminate perceived threats rather than focusing on developing his own skills or supporting team success. The transformation of my career reached an unexpected pinnacle when I was invited to speak at the National Consulting Excellence Conference about leadership resilience and organizational culture change. The invitation came with a note from the conference organizer. Your story has become legendary in our industry, not just as an example of individual resilience, but as a case study in how organizations can transform toxic cultures into environments that truly support excellence. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of hundreds of industry leaders, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to that moment. 18 months of systematic harassment had been transformed into a platform for sharing insights about authentic leadership and organizational health. The most dangerous threat to organizational excellence, I told the audience, isn't external competition or market disruption. It's internal toxicity, the cancer of destructive management that drives away talent, undermines performance, and creates cultures of fear and mediocrity. I shared the specific tactics that had been used against me, not for sympathy, but to help other leaders recognize and address similar patterns in their own organizations. But the most important lesson from my experience isn't about surviving workplace harassment. It's about the incredible potential that can be unleashed when organizations commit to creating environments where people can truly thrive. The response was overwhelming. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of executives who shared similar stories from their own organizations, and many who asked for consultation on transforming their corporate cultures. The speaking engagement led to an unexpected opportunity that would define the next phase of my career. Elizabeth approached me with a proposal to create a new division within Meridian Dynamics, focused specifically on organizational culture consulting. "Sarah," she said, "you've become an expert in something that every company needs but few understand: how to identify and eliminate toxic management while building cultures that actually support excellence. The proposal was to establish a culture excellence division that would work with client organizations to assess their management practices, identify destructive patterns, and implement systems that promote authentic leadership and employee thriving. I accepted the opportunity, and within a year, we were working with Fortune 500 companies across multiple industries, helping them transform cultures that had been unknowingly harboring their own versions of Marcus. The work was deeply fulfilling because it allowed me to prevent other talented professionals from enduring what I had experienced. We developed assessment tools that could identify toxic management patterns before they caused significant damage, training programs that taught authentic leadership skills, and intervention protocols for addressing destructive behavior when it was discovered. But perhaps most importantly, we created support systems for employees who were experiencing workplace harassment, ensuring that they had resources and advocacy that I had been forced to navigate alone. Today, 5 years after that Tuesday afternoon meeting that changed everything, I serve as Vice President of Culture Excellence for Meridian Dynamics, leading a team of consultants who work with organizations worldwide to create healthier, more productive work environments. The Pemberton Project, which Marcus had intended to be the instrument of my professional destruction, became the foundation for a completely new career, trajectory that has been more fulfilling and impactful than anything I could have imagined. But the most meaningful aspect of my transformation isn't the professional recognition or financial success, it's the letters and emails I receive from people who have attended my presentations or worked with our consulting team, sharing their own stories of overcoming workplace harassment and building authentic leadership skills. Sarah, one recent email read, "Your story gave me the courage to document the toxic behavior I was experiencing and report it to senior leadership. Not only was the situation addressed, but I was promoted to lead the department after the destructive manager was removed. Thank you for showing me that survival isn't enough. We can actually thrive despite and because of these challenges." These messages remind me that individual resilience, while important, isn't the ultimate goal. The real victory comes when we use our experiences to create systemic changes that protect and empower others. Marcus thought he was destroying my career when he said I wasn't fit for leadership. What he actually did was reveal that I was fit for a kind of leadership he couldn't even comprehend. Leadership that builds people up rather than tearing them down, that creates excellence through empowerment rather than control, that transforms challenges into opportunities for growth and positive change. The most powerful form of victory isn't defeating those who try to destroy you, it's transforming their weapons into tools for building something better. Sometimes the people who try to break us end up being the catalysts for our greatest breakthroughs. Have you ever experienced a moment when what seemed like professional disaster actually became the foundation for something extraordinary? Share your story in the comments, because sometimes the best way to heal from toxic experiences is to help others recognize their own strength and potential.